Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 5. This is the overview video for Introduction to Anthropology's 5th week. So I'm going to start off this week like I do usually. I'm going to have a recap of last week. It seems like everyone is staying on track with the assignments. There's only a few of you who didn't turn in the challenge or debrief, and it was about the same for most of you who completed the quiz and the reflective note. Remember that some of these assignments I still accept if you turn them in late. So if you miss a deadline, you can normally always go back and finish that assignment still for a grade. This is super helpful in terms of staying out of risk for failing the course. But the longer you wait on the past assignments, the harder it will be to return to them and do quality work, especially if multiple assignments get missed and start stacking on top of one another. So just keep that in mind. Also, I want to remind you all that last week's challenge assignment was only the first 10 points of the possible 25 points that you can earn for that assignment. The remaining 15 points for that assignment will be earned through the second part, the personal reflection and the identification of learning outcomes that were achieved in the process. You can check out the grading breakdown for this assignment in the rubric for that assignment on its page. The second half of the assignment is not due until after the 28-day challenge has occurred on March 3rd. But remember, the challenge is ongoing, so make sure you are writing down notes about your experience as you move forward week to week. This week, we have a quiz, we have a reflective note, and we have challenge number 4 with its debrief and discussion. So quiz number 4 is due on Wednesday. This covers material that you will read about in this week's textbook chapter on language written by Dr. Mike Wesch. By Friday night, you will have completed your reflective note on the learning outcomes you feel you better understand because of this week's lesson, as well as what metaphors are used in your major or professional career. And lastly, how success is defined in this major or career. This is a good exercise for thinking outside of the box of common perspectives in your field of interest, or just for understanding what priorities you are aligning yourself with in your education. Maybe it gives you the space to think a little bit differently about them. Lastly, your challenge 4 this week will focus on how language shapes our world, and you will specifically be in charge of creating a new word as an example of this process. The goal is to create a word that you believe will produce a positive impact in our human world, one that might inspire or refresh our view of ourselves, one another, our environment, our experience in general. Try to create something that resonates with yourself and what you believe would resonate with others. Be sure that it's a new word to describe something that you haven't heard a word for prior to this, or a phrase for. So don't shorten an already existing word, but create something that is all on your own. Like for instance, this week I created a word called enviroct, which in my definition is the potentially debilitating awareness of an entirely new environment, and can be used as an adjective to describe the moment or feeling when you enter a different climactic environment and your senses are so stimulated that you are unable to easily describe what's happening or what you're feeling. You may even use this word to communicate that you need to take some time to settle into the sensory overload and environmental stressors. So imagine taking an airplane from the Altiplano environment of Cusco, Peru, to the tropical island of Hawaii. And when you get off the plane in Hawaii, you are met with humidity, atmospheric pressure, oxygen levels, suites of smells and color palettes, all totally different from what your senses were stimulated with before boarding the flight. You might even fall ill without resting or taking things slow in this new environment. In these moments, you are envirocked. Once you are motivated by the power behind the word you create, add it to the lexicon and share it with others. Use it in speech with friends and family, or perhaps in a social media post. The point of this is to get others to use the word, to create dialogue, to infuse it with meaning. During this time, you can observe and engage with the liminal space of language, where you get to see how your new word is both existing, but not quite yet with a solidified meaning, because that is only achieved through a shared understanding and shared use. Here, you will get a chance to experience how the weaving of words that explains how your personal experiences relate to a word is what ultimately gives it meaning and defines it. This process of communicating on meaning is integral to the evolution of language, integral to cooperation, and it shows us that words are meaningless unless they are shaped by one another's perception of and experience with the world. This will help you to answer the final questions of the challenge and will inform you a bit more about how language in the form of your word is tied to social and cultural relations. For instance, my word enviroct assumes that one has traveled far away from their original location, or at least traverses different environments and would be most useful or applicable in a culture where long distance traveling is possible or frequent. I argue that this word as a part of language is symbolic of a globalized culture. And I hypothesize that the phenomena might be observable in tourists or people who have never traveled internationally before and are leaving their country or environment of origin for the first time. And maybe, just maybe, if this word were popularized, it could be helped to communicate in a relationship between people with different degrees of acclimation. Or in other words, the feelings of someone who has traveled to a new place, communicating to another person who is already completely acclimated to that same environment. Similar to the way that we might already use the phrase culture shock, but rather than focusing on different impacts of cultural differences, this communicates about the impacts of environmental differences. So once you turn in your answers to the 4 questions in the challenge assignment this week, don't forget to do your debrief and the discussion with your classmates for this assignment. Some reminders on the learning materials that you'll be engaging with this week. You have your lesson 4 video with Dr. Mike Wesch. You have your lesson 4 reading, the book chapter in The Art of Being Human. This is the reading on language. You have this video from your instructor. You have a few videos for challenge 4 that stem from John Koenig's Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. Really good TED Talk that goes along with this challenge. Definitely worth a look. Going to be very helpful for you in this assignment. And then your TED Talk video on how language shapes our speech and a podcast about learning language again after suffering brain damage from a stroke. These things will be useful for your reflective note. That's all I have to remind you on this week. So I'm going to leave you from field notes from Guam. I want to start off with a quote from our reading this week. It's the first quote in our chapter. It says, "Our most basic assumptions are embedded in the basic elements of our everyday lives." And this is especially true in the elements we use to describe what we do, aka language. So this week I want to share a bit about words meaning different things to different people, even when it's a commonly used word. So I was recently at a screening of a documentary called For the Love of Water, which interviewed Pacific Islanders from Guam, Tinian, Rota, and Hawaii about the struggles that they have faced in their lives in relation to fresh water. For many of them, there was an unmistakable correlation between the contamination of their freshwater sources and the environmental impacts of military operation on their islands. The documentary included perspectives and experiences from community leaders, activists, scientists, lawyers, and senators. I found it to be an informative overview of some of the issues that are ongoing in these places, and I heard how people describe their relation to water as being more than one that relied on it for basic life necessity. Rather, it was a core part of their cultural and personal identity. One interviewee identified how the concern for water quality has always influenced their traditional subsistence practice of fishing. And just like how preventing the destruction of Trunkanunu, or banyan trees, was an act of protecting a cultural symbol of meaning, so too was protecting against water contamination. Water has long been very meaningful, but the words, the message, and the people who have carried forth that meaning have changed in more ways than one. So there were different organizations that had set up their own information booths in the lobby of the lecture hall where the debut was located that shared their mission, educational materials, and representatives that spoke about how their cause overlaps with the message communicated by the documentary. Just from reading the names of the organizations, it was more or less apparent that water contamination would be an issue that they are concerned with, such as the Micronesian Climate Change Alliance and the Protect Guam Waters, or NIHI Guam. I then noticed that the government of Guam's Commission on Decolonization was there, and their booth had large bumper stickers with the phrase "Decolonize Now" on it. A friend of mine who I attended the debut with said, I remember when the commission was the Commission on Self-Determination. Its goals were sort of similar, but the focus was about gaining Commonwealth status. And they used to have a bumper sticker that said, Commonwealth now. I found this to be interesting, especially when I asked him if there were any water contamination issues during that time in the past that might have motivated that commission. Among many other issues that were behind the Commonwealth Act movement, my friend said, oh yes, Agent Orange was a big issue for people back then. Just like other toxic contaminants they are worried about today. Considering how water and in general, their relation to nature was voiced as an insignificant part of the cultural and personal identity of people who were featured in the film, I started to realize why an organization like the Commission on Decolonization would be there in support of their message. It was not so much about the words used or the name of their commission. It was the meaning behind gaining authority in the control of their own natural resources, and by extension, their own identity. That was a point of solidarity between the documentary and the commission. The meaning of water has only been reproduced by different ways of explaining it, but nonetheless, it has retained the deep sense of identity and belonging that it has for Indigenous peoples of the Pacific. Again, it's a point of solidarity to organize over. Without an understanding of the history and culture of these places, it might be hard to understand how all of these groups might overlap with one another. However, assuming that they would have different interests because they are different organizations with different stated missions, would only be considering the surface level of those people who were involved. Another instance where I see this different meaning for different people under the use of the same word, I found after listening to how a Chamorro man explained to me why they consider the word mitigation a misnomer. I saw once again how they were there was much deeper and different meaning at play for some people in Guam when they thought about cultural resource management that occurs under contract for the most recent military base buildup. He said, and I quote, they, meaning SHPO employees, always use the word mitigation to ease our concerns. Like if they run into a burial, then they are going to assess the risk to it and then try to reduce that risk through a mitigation strategy. But I get the feeling that they just assume there are no other risks to be mitigated beside those they decide to mitigate. But I wonder, maybe they miss the biggest risk, end quote. When I ask what that risk is, he responds, quote, they put a target on our home. If it gets blown up, what's the use of your so-called mitigation, end quote. Although I understood that the scale of mitigation that he identifies is out of the scope and authority of cultural resource management and professionals in the field of historic preservation, it does bring to light how basic assumptions are embedded in the language we use, especially in regulatory protocols that assess what a risk actually is and what is considered a mitigation strategy. Okay, so that's all I have to share with you this week. I hope we all start to challenge ourselves with the deep sense of what a language actually is, what meaning actually is, and how it comes from our social and cultural interactions in these spheres of our world. Okay, enjoy your week and I bid you adieu.